Hey folks, I'm Skylar Rochelle from the Z Show here on 90.9 The Bridge. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Mia Berrin, the front woman of the Brooklyn four-piece project known as Pom Pom Squad, who just released their stunningly cinematic debut album Death of a Cheerleader on June 25th via City Slang Records. Mia, thank you so much for coming in to say howdy.
Thank you. Howdy to you as well.
So, how do you feel about the response you've gotten from folks since the album's release?
It's been really surreal, honestly. I think I have the kind of anxiety where I just prepare myself for everyone to hate everything I do. So I think when people like it's like even better. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I was just listening to the album yesterday, and it's just such an incredible project. I love it so very much personally. Um, and I feel like I recently saw you did something with Rolling Stone, which is like huge.
Yeah. That was definitely one of the crazier moments of this whole thing.
Yeah, I feel like that's definitely, kind of the dream, or at least a dream.
Sort of. Well, I mean, I not sort of, definitely, but I remember like watching Almost Famous with my best friend in high school, and it's like being Rolling Stone is like the biggest deal, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, go big or go home, right?
That's what I always say.
And so you also signed with City Slang during the pandemic, which I feel like is super wild and just like a very unique situation. What was that kind of like?
Yeah, City Slang is just the best. During the year before the pandemic, we were still kind of baby band, and we'd gotten a booking agent right before everything happened, and we had done our first show across the country in San Francisco, and we're supposed to go on these two tours and start by doing South by Southwest, and all of a sudden just I mean, we all know the story by now, everything fell through. But also around that time, the EP, we did an EP called Ow, was getting enough interest that labels and industry people were just kind of starting to uh, be interested and want to have initial conversations. But after everything got canceled, like everyone just fell off the face of the earth. And suddenly it felt like we were in the middle of this big moment that just suddenly was gone. Like everything that we had been working towards was gone. And City Slang was actually the only label that was like, hey, we're still interested in working with you, and we still like you, and we're still here, and we still care. So I definitely hardballed them because I went to school partially for music business, and I'm very extra about contracts. So after a lot of hardballing, we had some really productive discussions, and it ended up working, and I love them. I feel really lucky that they trusted me to make this because my pitches were pretty unhinged.
That's so awesome. And I really respect the heck out of, you going in there and like knowing what you're worth sort of a thing and playing that hardball, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, that definitely should be more of a thing, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I think equity in the music industry is not really discussed enough. Um, it's kind of like Hollywood, where there's this unspoken rule of, well, if you don't take it, somebody else will, and there's not enough room for everyone, and it's very toxic. It's a very toxic way to approach this because there is room for everybody. There's so many resources to go around; they're just not distributed well enough. Um, so I think asking for what you're worth, it's a lesson that I had to learn the hard way, but I'm glad that I did. And I hope that continues. It's like a trend that continues among like smaller artists.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I heard down the grapevine that originally this project started this sort of, I don't know if this is the right word to use, but like fake band or sort of like a bit.
Yeah,
I was really curious how that like came about.
that's true. How did that come about? Well, when I was in high school, I started to learn about riot girl punk and grunge and kind of DIY from there. And so I always knew I kind of wanted to start a band, and I sang and I played guitar, but I didn't ever really see women of color like fronting indie punk DIY bands. So I think I just assumed that that didn't happen, and so it wasn't an option for me. But I was always a big music fan, and I went to a lot of shows, especially in my formative teenage years. So for my 18th birthday, my parents got me a suitcase and a ticket to Pitchfork Music Festival. And I went with my sister in Chicago. And I met this dude in the audience who was kind of like, I have a band, and I have this habit, or I used to have this habit of like, I don't like letting people big man me. Like, I don't, it really, I don't know. I'm the worst type of personality where if somebody's trying to big man me, I'm like, oh yeah, like I have a band. I also have a band. And so I, on the spot, was like, oh, I have this band. And I had taken all the usernames of Pom Pom Squad on social media. Like, for some reason, I was like, if I ever start a band, I think I would call it Pom Pom Squad. And so I told my first lie about being in a band. And then we became friends. And so then I had to back up the lie and write music. And so I did. I did. And I would send it to this person that I met. And, I really liked it, and it was a great outlet. And then my freshman year of college, so the next year, a couple months later, I don't know, I went to school to study acting. And so at the time I was doing like some students' short film, and it was like, the film was about a party. And so they were like, let's just throw a giant party for 3 days straight. And so it was like day 2, and I was just super exhausted. And there were these dudes that were like, oh, we study music tech and we have a band. And I was like, I also have a band. Like, I couldn't help myself. But then at that point I had like, a couple demos, including Lux, which was the first single on the new album, Death of a Cheerleader. And they liked it. And that's, how I started playing live. I was actually playing with these dudes that I lied to about having a band.
That's such a good origin story. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's because I have too much ego is basically the origin of Pom Pom Squad.
So for this record, would you consider it a coming of age album?
I guess. I mean, I used to find that kind of pejorative, because I think it's always been, used like, coming of age. I mean, I think the way that people talk about youth and about teenagers is pretty belittling. This idea of like, it's just a phase, you don't know what you're dealing with, you're melodramatic. And it's like, I have a mood disorder, and I didn't find that out until last year, because I think everybody kind of just told me like, you're a teenage girl, you're moody, you're sensitive. And it's kind of like, sure, but also, I needed help in that way. And so when I hear coming of age, I think I used to have this association with it being less than, but now I realize it's like, I'm in my early 20s. I'm coming of my early 20s. Like, I think you can have a coming of age at any point in your life. And I think, yeah, in a way, this time that I was writing about was definitely a coming of age. I was realizing a lot about my queer identity and my identity as a person of color, and just, my identity as a person with a mood disorder. Just like having a lot of big moments in my life that I wouldn't have been able to process when I was a teenager. And I think, that is its own coming of age in a way.
Yeah, I really love that. Like it's true. Like, we're all perpetually coming of age, always. And I think that's something really cool that isn't always kept in mind all the time.
Yeah.
So after high school, you went to NYU for acting, but ended up transferring to music school, which is awesome. Having experience in those two forms of art, both film and music, what specifically draws you to them individually?
Well, I think initially I was drawn to acting. I love movies. Just genuinely, I love movies, and I love this idea of character study and sort of, figuring out what's going on behind someone else's eyes. I think that was something that always fascinated me about really good acting, was somebody's ability to tell a story, or your ability to pick up on the nuances of somebody's behavior, the things that sit under their words, that, when people say things they don't really mean, but what they really mean. Like those kind of interactions really fascinate me. And that was kind of the whole point of the acting program that I was in, was kind of developing characters in our world. And we were working a lot in modern realism. So we were doing like Chekhov and Ibsen and, a lot of the kind of like classic white people plays, like plays that were written by white people and are about white people. And I think I was very quickly alienated from that, not only because of my race, but just also, it's like I was singled out in really negative ways that I realized I was having this whole thought process about this whole thing yesterday. But it's like, one example is I remember I was in a class and the teacher, who's like an adult, was like, everyone in this class is really fun. Everyone except Mia, and it's kind of like, what a weird thing for an adult to say to an 18-year-old, you know what I mean? In a like in a college education setting, like, it's just not a piece of feedback. But I think, again, kind of going back to this idea of the culture of, like wanting, just like, if you don't do it, someone else will. The culture of like desperation really pushed me away from it. Because I felt that desperation and I felt that need for validation and that need to be liked, and it's just not a sustainable way to live. And kind of similarly to how I found music initially, it was kind of like my first love that, waited for me, like the character in the romance movie that's like, whenever you're ready, I'm here, music was kind of like that. But I think they play into each other in more ways than I would have thought. I feel like I learned more about acting by not doing it than I did by doing it.
Really?
Yeah. I think acting ultimately, in my opinion, is about big picture. And, when you're in a scene, what you're supposed to be thinking about is like, if the scene is me sitting in my bedroom doing an interview, it's like I should be thinking about the things that I'm thinking about right now, which is like, how am I speaking well? How are my words connecting? Versus what I would think about when I was acting was, am I good? Do people like me? Do I like, are people going to say that I'm good at it? Like, it was just not, I was behaving to be told I was good rather than behaving to tell a story ultimately. And it's kind of like, I was in a class once where they were like, for a movie, the method of communication is a shot. So you can have movies without any people in it, but the story moves along as long as the shot changes, or as long as the action changes. A play, the method of communication, well, sorry, not play, a book, the method of communication is a word. Like if you're reading a book or if you're reading a script, you can't tell the story without words. Versus like if you're watching a live performance, like the method of communication is an actor, unless you're just like watching an empty stage. So it was like, I didn't think of myself as a method of communication. I thought of myself as like an individual who needed to be told that I was good at this to be able to be good at it. And it's just not healthy. And I think in music, as I started to develop Pom Pom Squad, one, speaking in my own words was really important for me, singing in my own voice, dressing the way I wanted to dress, I'm worrying less about if people thought I was good and more about what I wanted to say. And I think the stakes at a certain point felt so low. I'm definitely a perfectionist. And so before I did my first show, I was like practicing in a mirror, like really going all in, but I wasn't doing this to be a professional musician at the time, And so it was just a really pure form of creative expression for me, and I think it was a really important part of me finding my autonomy as a young adult, coming of age, coming of my early 20s, coming of my very early 20s. But yeah, I think what draws me to both is that they play into each other. You know, ultimately what it's about is telling a story and digging into a personalized experience, whether it's your own or someone else's. And, you know, when you put that into the world, like letting people perceive it however they want. But what matters is the internal life. And I think working on music has put that into focus for me.
That's wonderful. And I think that's really cool. And I think it's really awesome that you are able to combine both of those kinds of art forms within this project.
Thank you.
Yeah, this album is just so incredibly like cinematic in like the musical element, like lyrically and visually. And I was very curious how you felt about combining your music with like music videos and what that kind of adds to what you're saying and the overall message within this album.
I think even before Pom Pom Squad was the band where I big manned people to bring it into existence, you know, when I initially thought of the name, you know, I've always been really inspired by girl groups, and you know, I think because Riot Girl was an early intro for me, I loved the idea of starting a band that was just as strong aesthetically as it was musically. So they've always worked hand in hand for me. I think, you know, the process that I hear most often is people write a song and then, you know, they come up with a music video idea later. But I feel like while I'm writing, I'm kind of already thinking about how everything is going to feel visually. It's almost weird to me if I can't come up with a visual until after the song's written. I'm sure that's going to happen in the near future for me. But with this project in particular, everything really worked pretty, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very symbiotic relationship. Like everything fed everything else.
Yeah, for sure. I get that. So would you say you're like a very visual thinker?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And it's wild because like you pay a whole lot of like homage to films that you're a fan of, like The Virgin Suicides, Pink Flamingos, But I'm a Cheerleader, and like tons of others. And you also like sample a whole lot of tunes, which is
Yeah.
awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really cool to see that, especially as like such a prominent portion of the album and stuff like that.
It makes me really happy that people get that, because I think that was something that I was worried about. And I think there's there tends to be this conversation about like copying and stealing, and you know, I think for me, I created what I couldn't see myself in. And because so much of my early introduction to visuals and art, you know, were through these movies and plays and stories that I loved so much, but I didn't see myself in the Virgin Suicides, you know, like I wasn't a pretty white girl, you know, who had, it's like obviously male attention was not the point, and it's actually quite the opposite of the point of the book. But you know, when you're a teenager and you're kind of watching it on the surface level and you just see like pretty girls who have this mythology and people love them and people are obsessed with them. It's like I grew up not ever thinking that I was attractive or like worthy of attention. And I think that was also compounded by media, you know, growing up with like 17 magazine and watching, you know, it's like I can't think of any of the shows that I grew up with right now, but like all the teen shows, it was typically, you know, like thin, white, conventionally attractive young people. And because I didn't fit that, you know, the way that I grew up at the time, like it just made me feel like there's no room for myself anywhere.
Right.
And even with a movie like But I'm a Cheerleader, you know, I don't look like anybody in that movie. My experience was never like anyone in that movies, other than being femme and gay. But it's like you take those grains, you know, Virgin Suicides, like dealing with depression in a similar way to the girls. Like you take these little breadcrumbs, and for me, direct reference is such a huge part of my work because it's my way of like putting myself inside of the art that I've always loved, you know, because otherwise I don't know how to exist in a way. I like grew up on pop culture, and it was always my model for everything. And what I love about sampling too is the way that it really seamlessly can connect to really different moments in pop culture. Like the example I always use is when Frank Ocean sampled Elliott Smith.
Oh yeah.
You know, like that was such an iconic moment. And I remember like hearing that and just crying because it feels like two completely different worlds. But, you know, when you really think about both of them, like they're not all that dissimilar. Like it's just a genre difference and obviously a time period difference, you know, by just the slight amount. So I love that. And I love the idea of even if you don't initially connect the reference, like the first time you see it, like there's so many songs that, you know, I grew up on a lot of hip hop, and there's so many songs where I grew up on a certain song and then, you know, a year, 2 years, 5 years later, I hear like the original sample, you know, the original song, and it's like mind blowing. That actually happened. The song This Can Happen is an interpolation of the song Again. There's multiple versions, but the one that I referenced was the one that Doris Day performed. And I actually heard that song for the first time, like in a beat that somebody had put on a tape.
Wow.
And then when I found the original song, it was just like a perfect, you know, encapsulation of that moment and that feeling. So I love creating that. And, you know, my dream and goal for the record is for people to, you know, see the original works and go, oh my God, it's that thing. You know what I mean? Like, that's where it came from. And realize, you know, it's a way of connecting culture and widening it rather than, you know, a way of like closing doors or setting hard boundaries.
Yes, yes. And I think it's really wonderful that not only are you combining all of these different like film and like samples and like blending these genres, as well as like all aspects and intersections of you as an artist and your unique identity to make this piece of media that like kind of represents it all. And I just feel like it's so needed and underrepresented. So thank you for doing something like that. I think it's really cool.
Caring about it. I mean, I think that's what means the most to me is at the, you know, at the end of the day, like I made it because I needed to make it. And, you know, it felt like there were things that were resting in my head that were taking up so much space that it was almost like painful not to do anything about it.
Yeah.
The fact that it like means something to anyone else, you know, is like kind of unbelievable. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. And as far as that kind of goes, when I was preparing for this interview, I came across another where you talked about really like enjoying looking out onto the stage into the crowd just to like see people just like sobbing, which I find really wonderful and kind of a wild question. How do you feel about crying as like an emotion or act?
It's awesome. I think it's great. I mean, crying as an emotional act, it's like, I think it's a really physical expression of catharsis. Like, you know, when I think of catharsis, sometimes I think about like smashing someone with a baseball bat, you know, but it's like that's me physically acting on something else. And it's like your body is acting on itself to try to release something that exists in here, you know, and that's so cool when you really think about it. It's like everything you need is inside you, all the catharsis you need, all the feelings, everything you could possibly create, as long as it's filtered through your brain. That's the cool thing.
Crazy. Wild.
Crazy.
Who would have thought? The vocal delivery throughout this entire LP is just extremely compelling. And as someone with backgrounds in both acting and music, are there any similarities or even differences that you found when it comes to delivering lines versus lyrics?
Yeah. Well, I think the main difference when I'm singing my own stuff, at least, is that they're my own words, you know, and they can be very direct. I think maybe, I don't know, like now that I think about it, maybe that's one of the reasons that my lyrics tend to be a little bit more blunt rather than like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, I don't really try to obscure anything.
Yeah, they pack a punch.
Versus like when I was acting, it feels like I was, it's kind of your job. It's like you're forced to obscure something under somebody else's story, what you may or may not be feeling. And sometimes it's just not about you at all. Like sometimes there are some schools of acting where they think, you have to like remember your dog who died every time you want to do a scene where you cry. And I just think that's not healthy or sustainable. Ooh, we're getting controversial. So many actors can't stand me, but many of my acting friends are former acting friends, but there is a school of thought where it's kind of like you should feel something every time you act, and I just don't think that's true. And I would probably, like, young me would probably be really upset to hear myself say that, but I think a lot of the time, like, when you're performing your own songs, in a way it's acting, because I'm not always going to feel enraged when I do a song like Heavy, but it all exists inside of me, and so sometimes all it takes is like playing it, and it puts you in a place. And even if I'm not experiencing a bout of spiraling depression, it doesn't make it mean any less or make the performance less significant. I don't know if that answers the question. They're similar in some ways and different in other ways, but I think I think I much prefer performing my own words, at least right now.
Yeah, and that's really cool that you've found that, especially at like such a young age. I mean, I'm 20, so I'm going to talk, but
oh my god, you.
Yes. But anyways, getting back on track, what I really love about Death of a Cheerleader is that sort of like vocal dynamicism, dynamics. You know what I'm saying?
I trust you.
Thank you. That comes with blending those very orchestral cinematic moments with more punk or grunge styles. And I feel like that combo is rarely seen. I mean, if ever, I guess until now. What made you want to bring those two together?
Well, I think grunge and punk tends to be my mode in general. Like, it was my intro to music, and so when I write, I think naturally it goes to that place. But especially during the pandemic, I was listening to a lot of Motown and 50s and 60s novelty songs, and I was listening to a lot of girl groups. I was listening to a lot of jazz standards, and it's kind of like perfect songwriting, those melodies are just so incredible. And this idea of pop music is this big orchestral scene. I don't know, it's very touching. Something about songs from that era always makes me want to cry, and immediately puts me in a place that feels ungrounded in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the difference between punk and that for me is whenever I would write before, I was always thinking about, well, how do I bring this into a band practice, and how do I translate it onto stage versus, there was no stage in the near future, or at least it seemed that way. So I got to experiment with writing stuff that had nothing to do with physical space, which was like an exciting prospect. So I think bringing them together felt sort of natural, but once I figured out that was going to be the crux of the album, it was also fun to move around, what songs could tell the story and in what order, and how many were straight, Motown, and how many were straight grunge, and how many were like somewhere in the middle. It was a really fun process, and it was really weird. And I think in the vein of using homage to bring in all these things that I love to the project, it was sort of similar, like bringing so many genres of music that, meant so much to me into this one project.
I think that's so awesome. And like, it's just so rad that it's not just one thing, like it's all of these things. It's very like multifaceted, which is very refreshing to see and very awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so in making this album, you co-produced it with Sarah Tujan of Illuminati Hotties, who I feel like is just an incredible powerhouse in that sort of realm. What was that like?
Yeah, I would definitely describe Sarah as a powerhouse. Absolutely. She's also just really skilled. Like it sounds simplistic, but she has a really vast tool belt to grab from. And she knows how to use it. It was really amazing to work with somebody who just brings that much savvy. And we seem to have really similar what's the word I'm looking for? We had really similar influences and ideas. And in our first conversation, we were talking about Phil Spector and this idea of the wall of sound production style, which also plays into the kind of like throwback aesthetic of the record in some ways. But we really worked together to make something that didn't sound like a band in a room, yeah, working with Sarah was great. I feel really lucky that, that collaboration turned out the way that it did. And I think I also feel really honored to be the co-producer with someone like her,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's huge. I feel like producing is always, I don't know, I think it's really cool that you and Sarah both did it instead of, taking it to like, a straight white man and being like, hey, produce this, like I think that's sick.
Well, yeah, I mean, I said it a little bit before, but I went to a program called Clive Davis at NYU, which is like music business, performance, music production, journalism, musicianship, a couple other things, but it's really multifaceted. And specifically, I wanted to go to learn how to produce because that was one of the areas that I hated relying on people. It felt, I didn't have the language, and there's a lot of jargon, when it comes to production, which makes it feel a lot less accessible than it is. So being able to have a part in that process and having done the pre-production myself, it's just, I feel really accomplished. I feel really proud of myself, and it's like a skill that I want to continue to hone. And Sarah was really inspiring to watch in that way as well.
Yeah, that's so good. You mentioned the aesthetic of this album, which I feel like needs to be mentioned because it is so freaking rad. And I really wanted to touch on the album cover. What could you talk a little bit about the significance of that image?
Yeah. Well, I knew that I wanted the record to be called Death of a Cheerleader, and kind of had that title sitting in my back pocket for a while. Or I knew an eventual album I wanted to call Death of a Cheerleader. And when I started writing some of these songs, I think Be Good specifically was the one where I was like, this is a cool idea, and I want to do more of this. I was thinking a lot about that time, a certain time in my life. That time, as if everybody knows what time. I was thinking a lot about a certain time in my life where I was coming to terms with my queer identity in a way that I never had before. And part of that was kind of waking up one day and realizing I was not living a life that was designed for myself. Meaning I had designed my life around a white beauty standard and an aspiration for male attention, and things that I'm still fighting against in certain ways, but that I don't want, that ultimately, like, I don't want to aspire to whiteness or to masculine validation. And at the time, I was also thinking a lot about texture. I think the first thing I said to the band is I was like, I want to make an album that sounds like red vinyl and red velvet. And they were like, okay. So I was thinking a lot about texture, and I was thinking a lot about, I was watching a lot of RuPaul's Drag Race. I was watching a lot of John Waters. I was watching a lot of David Lynch. And I love this idea of artifice and plastic and these settings that all felt kind of too good to be true, or that subverted a very heteronormative standard, or just kind of like a standard of normalcy at all. Like, I love the neighborhood in Blue Velvet and that intro scene where it's this like perfect manicured neighborhood, and then suddenly it becomes something really dark and creepy and uncomfortable. And I liked this idea of like being buried in a grave. Obviously, Death of a Cheerleader as a title, but also being buried under this like plastic world, this, you know, this fake, too good to be true, I don't know, like ideal version of what I should be. And it was really rewarding to physicalize that. I started making these like plastic started making these plastic flower arrangements in my office at the beginning of the pandemic. And like, I lived in a 2-bedroom with my partner. And then I bought this big thing of AstroTurf because I was like, oh, we're going to do live streams. Like, why don't I make this crazy set? So now I have flowers and I have AstroTurf. And then I was like, I should get like a fake sky. And then I got a fake sky and I was like, I should get fake clouds. And then suddenly I had this room that was just like full of crazy plastic. Am I allowed to swear? Have I sworn? Okay. It was just like full of crazy plastic shit. And I was just kind of like, this is the world. Like, this is the world of the record. And, you know, it was, it all came together really, really beautifully. And it took a lot of inspiration from my life. It's an homage to a lot of things that I love. And yeah, it feels significant on a lot of levels for me personally. But I think that's kind of the bigger general idea, is like being buried under this creepy, organic, fake thing.
Yeah, and did I see that the album was actually like pressed on red vinyl?
Yeah.
So say.
Thank you.
Yes. So lastly, what do you want those listening to Death of a Cheerleader to get out of it?
What do I want them to get out of it? I don't know. I think something that I always think about is that everything is more complicated than it seems. Like, I think the society, we live in a society. I think the society we live in, and especially the internet and just the kind of model of the world as we know it, you know, on a social level, like makes it really easy to forget that nuance exists and, you know, sort of try to lock things into one box, or, you know, consider things really one-dimensionally. And I guess I want to challenge that a little bit, like, you know,
yeah,
in a very literal level, there's a lot of layers of influence that, so some nice alliteration. There's a lot of layers of influence that have made it into this piece, and it's like a scavenger hunt in a way. And I hope that people find, you know, all those little Easter eggs, and kind of, you know, I think I wanted to create a world that I didn't get to exist in, that tied together everything that I wanted to be and everything that I love artistically or loved artistically. And I don't know, I just hope it makes people's worlds a little bigger.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, thank you, Mia, so much for taking the time to talk with me here on 90.9 The Bridge about you and Pom Pom Squad's rocking and rolling debut LP, Death of a Cheerleader, that just came out on June 25th via City Slang Records. I appreciate it, and I'm so pumped for folks to give it a listen if they haven't already.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate your thoughtful questions.